Before we start this video on the engine build, we wanted to thank everybody that contributed on the live stream doing the super chats and the super thanks. I think Clayton might list some of them over here. We really appreciate their support. Let's get to the video. Man, oh man, has this been a long time coming. So, we're going to start assembling our new engine for the drag car. I've kind of filmed some of this. Clayton and I have footage of assembling, doing all the lash caps and everything on the new cylinder head from JD Portworks. Thank you again for this. We are now to the point of going to assemble this block. So the block, to kind of give you guys a little bit of an idea, we typically, for the last few years anyways, we've been O-ringing the blocks and originally we started with obviously stock MLS gasket, then we switched to O-ringing with still an MLS gasket, and now we're to the point of running a stainless O-ring with a copper custom head gasket. And now I've gone as far as, you can't really tell on this one because it is O-ringed already, but this block is actually sleeved, which is not a very common thing to do in the Volkswagen world, especially with a cast iron block. But we've learned from some of the guys that are going a lot faster than us, making a lot more power than us, that the backs of the blocks typically will split out of these when you're really trying to push them really hard, which is around the 1,000 horsepower mark. So some of the guys that are pushing the four-cylinder world in North America anyways are running sleeve block. We went through our own process of figuring out a sleeve option and all that. So this is kind of all custom for what we're doing. We've done 2 of these blocks like this now. The other one is going to be a full 1AT setup. And for those that aren't aware, our engine, yes, we're running a 16 valve cylinder head, which is old, but we are running a 1AT bottom end. So all this applies to a 1AT setup as well. It's just running a different cylinder head. So yeah, sleeve block. It's already been clearanced for the connecting rods. We're going to be running R&R aluminum connecting rods. I had a custom set of GAEs built, much stronger pin. There's endless stuff. We're doing a girdle as well. There's so much stuff for this setup, and I've been kind of, switch it around. There's so much stuff for this one, and I've been picking away at it for a very long time. And with COVID, the racetrack was closed for so long, and then this past year we just weren't able to get it together in time because I decided to switch standalone and do even more to the setup. So with that, it all just takes time and money, and here we are, time finally to assemble this thing. So the first thing on deck, I'm probably missing a whole bunch of stuff, but hopefully I get it with as I start to go through and assemble this thing. But the very first thing, we're using a forged crank from a 2-liter. It's already been drilled out. I already did this, drilled it out for more bolts in the flywheel so that doesn't come apart. But the very first thing I need to do is put the tone ring on, and with the tone ring, I have new bolts, but I'm also going to tack weld it so that it doesn't come off, or hope it never comes off, because again, we were spinning this thing to, last time on the dyno, I think I got up as high as like 9,500, something like that. I was very happy at 9,200. Maybe it was an oil pump or whatever on the old engine. I did end up spinning a bearing when I did turn it up a little bit more. So I do have to keep an eye on that stuff as I start leaning on it. I know at 9,200 it was very happy. If I get a little bit greedy with the RPM based on the turbo I have to keep an eye on the bearings. And also making sure this thing doesn't fly off. Otherwise we won't have any sync. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to get the tone ring on, or the trigger wheel, whatever you want to call it, and get that tacked in place, and then we can get the crank in the block and start doing the assembly, the rods, the pistons, all that stuff. So I'll probably put up the time lapse so you guys can see. I keep looking at the screen here. I don't know if I'm used to doing that versus the camera. My eyes are all over the place. Anyways, I'm going to set up the time lapse so that you guys can see this starting to go together. Finally, I'm so amped. All right, so the crank's in. The trigger wheel, I didn't film any of that, but the new bolts were red Loctited. They are brand new, torque to spec, and you can kind of see it in there. I tack welded each one of them a couple of times to keep that thing in place. So then next I got the crank in, obviously, and I got the billet mains. These are the tall boy billet mains from Integrated, because we're going to be running the girdle. So we're just about to put the girdle on now. The thrust washer in there, all the bearings are in there. So we're going to put the girdle on, and then we'll start getting the rods and pistons and stuff together to get those in there next. Okay, I stepped away from the block for a minute. I took the girdle back off because it has to be all sealed up and everything. So I'm just going to snug up the mains until I get the rods and pistons in the block to make sure that there's no clearance issues with anything or anything like that. So now I'm going to assemble the rods and pistons. One thing I had to do beforehand is the bearings come with a small hole like this. Are you going to focus? There you go. In the bearing. So for them, because the bottom of these rods have this pin here, it's essentially a locator. I had to drill out these bearings and deburr them and everything and chamfer them, which I did on the mill. So those are all ready to go now, and we're going to start getting the rods and pistons together, and then we can put them in the block. So follow along. Okay, moving right along. As you've seen, I verified the ring gap on the rings. They were already pre-gapped, not from factory. This was done a while ago, so I just wanted to verify everything before assembly. Also, in regards to the ring gap, people probably ask, what should it be? It's really based on and determined by the bore size of the cylinder and the piston manufacturer, and also what you're doing with the engine specifically. It's not a straight cut answer, based on 1ATs or 2 liters, what it should be. If you really want to do it right, make sure that you're doing the calculations based on the bore size and the piston manufacturer themselves, and usually all that information's in the pamphlet with the pistons. So enough about that ranting. I have the pistons and the rings and everything assembled now. I have everything set up the way I want them to be, hence the little red check marks. I've verified everything. The last thing I'll do is orientate the rings the way I want them, and I do that last before I slip it in here, just because every time you pick them up and move them, they're going to move. So that'll be one last step, and I'll start chucking in the bearings. And as I mentioned earlier, we got all the bearings drilled out for the bottom caps. So now trying to get the pistons and rods in the block. Okay, so we're about to put the girdle on. I did put the oil pump gear on already, as you guys would have seen. I have the girdle all cleaned up. I've checked everything for clearance to make sure everything is good, nothing's touching or coming super close to it. I did need to clearance the oil pump. It is in the instructions, not all of them are like that, but as you can see, there's a bolt, or the stud right there. Maybe it's not in focus. Just needed to clearance the pump a little bit. So now we're ready to tighten this down for the final time and start getting I don't know, the rest of it together. The head, although it's on, is not completely on. It's not timed or anything like that. There's only a couple head studs in it. They're not tightened down. But what we needed to do, which we didn't really film much of because it's very, very tedious, and it's going to be specific for everybody's application. So showing you exactly what I've done in this engine and with these cams isn't going to be for the next guy. So, but what we need to do to degree the cams is we put a dial indicator on basically the bucket, and we're measuring valve lift. And based on the specs from Cat Cams, which I can show you on this specific cam for this engine, the valve lift on this thing needed to be 3.4 millimeters and 1.6 millimeters on the exhaust. So basically we're measuring valve lift with the dial indicator. This is done multiple times to verify everything is the way it should. You do it on both the intake and the exhaust valve. You rotate it over, you measure so many things, it takes so much time, but I wanted to just kind of briefly touch on that before we go further in the video, showing you valve to piston clearance and stuff like that. So degreeing the cams properly based on the specs of the cams themselves, so that you're not running into issues with them hitting the pistons, or in turn actually getting the most out of the cam. So if you set them up properly, you're going to get the most out of them. That doesn't mean there's not more power to be had with adjusting the sprockets. There's adjustable sprockets in here on this one as well, both on the intake and exhaust and this one. And the reason that is because every turbo application, every engine, based on the turbo itself, has different flow characteristics and can make power or lose power based on cam degree angle. We're going to set them up the way that they are right from the factory. However, that doesn't mean once we get on the dyno we won't mess around with this again just to see if we can make a little bit more horsepower. And I will mention, this isn't set up the way it was when I had it on the car before. We've messed around with this since then, but just by moving the cam angle or just cam sprocket, even though on this engine before, when you move this, it moves both cams simultaneously. We gained about 80 wheel horsepower at the same boost level by moving this. We went one way, it lost power, moved the other way, it started gaining power, so we continued on with that. Anyways, so that's it for degreeing the cams. Next is valve to piston clearance, which we're going to have to do now. Okay, now that the cams have been timed, the next thing is to check valve to piston clearance. And the reason we do that is simply so that as the engine is rotating, the valves don't come in contact with the pistons. It kind of makes sense, exactly what it's called. And what we use to do that is some Play-Doh. This is only $1 at our local dollar store. So in the US, they probably just give you this for free there. So what we do is we take a big blob of that and we just mash it into the valve reliefs. This is all dried out, but you just basically mash it into the valve reliefs and put some on the exhaust side. You put the head back on, tighten it down, time it, rotate the engine over, and then you're essentially going to cut, which this one already is, cut a slit in the center of it so that you can measure the depth of the valve where it hits. If that's going to come in focus, I don't know. This isn't a good piece to look at, but we've spent hours putting the cylinder head on, timing it, taking it off, measuring. Like, I think we've had the engine timed probably 10 times now, and measuring this. And what we're doing is we're checking the distance between the valve and the piston. I don't know if that's in focus. the valve and the piston, both the depth here and the radial sidewall here. And in this case, the radial distance is a little too tight, which means I'm pulling this all back apart to get these pistons machined out a little bit further so that we don't run into issues. I want to be able to adjust the cam sprocket, whether it's the intake or exhaust or them together with this sprocket, because we did gain good power doing it before. So without having any risk, I'm pulling these all out. I have a spare set as well, and I'm going to get these machined out a little bit further so that we don't run into issues with valve to piston clearance. This is the reason you check it, is that if I wouldn't have and I chucked this together, for sure this thing would have bent all the valves in the thing. So that's what we got to do now, get it apart so we can get this machined. Okay, there they are, back out. They look brand new. It's like they've never been run. Oh, wait. So the next thing I got to do, obviously, is pull the pistons off the rods. And I'm going to send them all out together with the spare set I have to get machined. And the next time you'll see them, they'll be back in this for the last time. And that's how you ship an engine. This one came from Alaska. It's a 1AT. It's the next on the chopping block to get built. And if you ever need to ship us an engine, take note. Clayton. Back to the engine build. The cams are in now for the very last time. Well, I shouldn't say the very last time. Jesus, don't even
we had them in and out. No.
For the last time for this engine assembly. So they're all Loctited. The sprockets on the end, everything's in and torqued. Everything is as it should be. So it's now the time to focus on the block. We need to O-ring it. We'll show you guys what that involves. Put the head gasket on, put the cylinder head on, and torque it down. So let's get to it, as I always say. Okay, Clayton's got the O-ring done. So on this one, we're using a stainless O-ring and a copper head gasket. And I had a whole bunch of these cut specifically for our setups. We used to run copper O-rings and an MLS OEM gasket, but we switched it up to the copper gasket. When you do that, you need to run the stainless wire. So Clayton's got all that run in there now. It's kind of hard to see, but you get the gist. And what's going to happen is when the head gasket gets put on and the head gets clamped down, this is basically going to cut in to the copper gasket and creating a better seal, so we can run lots of boost, basically. All right, so we got the cylinder head on. I don't know how much dialogue I did while I was assembling this, but because this is a 1AT bottom end and a 16 valve head, there are some differences between the two and how you make this combination actually work. And I'll just mention a couple of things, but for most people, it's really not going to pertain. This is a 1AT cam sprocket. This is a integrated engineering manual tensioner kit. The 16 valve originally came with a manual tensioner like this. But again, the bottom end is all basically a 1AT block. Some of the differences when you're matting it to a 16 valve, there's a few things to do the 16 valve to this newer style block. Newer, it's like 20 years old now, but newer than the 16 valve was. And a lot of it has to do with how it's all spaced out. So the 16 valve cam sprocket would have put the timing belt in actually closer to the valve cover. So by doing it this way, everything kind of has to get spaced out quite a bit in order for it to line up with the crank sprocket on the 1AT bottom end. So anyways, that's all been done. There's a couple things I had to do to shim the idler roller out. A couple of things, but nothing too major. So everything's Loctited. Everything is basically set and timed, and now I'm to the point that it's just bolting on parts. So everything up till now has been kind of all new stuff. This is a different set of rods than we ran before, higher compression pistons than we ran before, bigger cam duration, different cams entirely, bigger valves. There's a lot of stuff that we changed on this, so a lot of it was putting it together and checking out what actually worked and making sure clearances were good and all that. And as you would have seen in the video, we had the cylinder head on and off probably 25 times, checking valve to piston clearance and indicating in the cams, or degreeing the cam, sorry. So a lot of work has gone into assembling this, but part of it is just because it was all new stuff to us. You know, the old engine, I had it apart and together so many times, and you get to a point where you know how things are supposed to be, but because this was all new, there's a lot of changes, and although it doesn't look that much different than the old setup, a lot of stuff, a lot of time and care had to go into making sure that this was set up properly. So with that said, the valve to piston clearance, it was close, but it was to the point where we'd want to move the cam degree probably on the dyno, so I wanted to give a little bit more room so we could sweep the cam a little bit. If it gets to a point where it's making a certain amount of power and we can try to squeeze a little bit more out of it by adjusting the cam sprocket, we're certainly going to do that. So I had I took the pistons back out and had them cut a little bit deeper to give us a little more room so we could play with the cam degree a little bit. So now I'll probably set the time lapse up and show you guys putting on just some of the random things, the turbo manifold, the intake manifold, all that stuff, putting on all the coolant stuff. I'm gonna do all the coolant lines in AN this time, so some of these cooling fittings and stuff like that, they're not gonna happen until it's actually in the car, because I bought all aluminum stuff and I have to weld stuff. But I can start getting the oil cooler on, the intake manifold, the exhaust manifold, and start making it look like an engine again, because it's got to go in the car. And so we can do some mock-up and stuff, and you're going to see some more with the car. Some stuff has changed since the last video that we would have put out on it, but let's get to putting some fancy parts on this thing. Also, as the assembly goes on, I did get sent these titanium nuts and studs. These ones are a little large. I'm not really sure what I'm going to use these ones for yet. Maybe somewhere in the intake manifold, throttle body, or something. But I also got some studs for the exhaust manifold, and they were sent in from GR Performance. There's his Instagram as well. We may actually add these to the website. I can't remember the cost breakdown of them. It's been a while. They've been sitting here, but I do appreciate these, and we do have them on the manifold. This manifold might actually come back off again, so I have to drill a reference for the back pressure sensor. But as you can see, I got the studs on. And before we run this thing, I'll likely Loctite all these nuts just to make sure that they don't back out. I haven't run titanium studs on anything before, so I don't know how they hold up with heat and all that. But the way that they go on and off, they definitely feel like they need some Loctite on there before we start running a bunch of heat through them. So, manifold's on. Time to do the intake manifold. Okay, a couple more things I wanted to mention about the engine in regards to the 16 valve cylinder head on the 1AT block. I mentioned about the spacing and all that stuff. One thing that is different for sure is the timing belt. The timing belt's actually shorter on the setup that I'm running, and it's specifically a 2JZ timing belt, which is a little bit odd, but the 1AT timing belt is quite a bit longer in this configuration, so that's something that needs to be changed. Also, you probably noticed in the video, the head studs look a little bit different than normal. Those are L19 head studs this time around, opposed to the regular ARP 2000 bolts that we would have used in the past. And the last thing I wanted to mention, I did write 1,000 horsepower on the pistons. Clearly the engine hasn't made 1,000 horsepower yet. I'm just kind of talking it into existence. So it hasn't made that power yet, but the goals are to make that power or more. So the more I kind of reiterate it, and again, just trying to make it come to reality. And with that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up, but before we do, I'll show you where we're sitting now. As you can see, the engine is in, and we've already started with the wiring and mounting everything. It's all going to come back out again because, again, that's a sneak peek. The paint, everything still all has to happen. We did paint the roll cage, but you'll see that in the next video specifically about the drag car. This one's just about the engine. So if you guys have any questions or comments based on this specific engine build, ask below. Thanks for all the support, and we'll see you in the next video.